Hello from Westeros.org. We're finally getting around to tackling the third of the Dunk and Egg novellas, The Mystery Knights.
So with textual history, I guess it's kind of tradition to kind of get into the history of when George was writing these, when they were published, how they relate to the series. The Mystery Knight was published in the Warriors anthology, and that anthology is one that actually George and his friend Gardner Dozois co-edited, and it was a sort of a cross-genre collection of, the theme was warriors, and they had various stories.
Was it the first one?
I don't know if it was the first anthology that they did, but
they've certainly gone ahead to do a series of these themed anthologies, particularly emphasizing the cross-genre parts. I think this is where George wants to get into the whole bit about it, just being furniture.
Yeah, it's a lot about the furniture. Some anthologies they've done, like they did the Old Mars and Old Venus, that's sort of strictly science fiction, but it's kind of planetary romance.
But you've had the dangerous women, you've had the rogues and warriors. Those are all basically, they can happen anywhere, anytime. It's just
So the book was published in March 2010. George wrote the story, I think, around 2009. So he's working on Dance with Dragons when he did it. And, we're about a year away from A Dance with Dragons getting published. And, as we noted, The Hedge Knight was written without any concept of the Blackfires. It was clear that George didn't really have that down when he wrote The Hedge Knight. It was something that he developed afterwards.
Very much so.
The Sword and Sword turns, the main plot isn't really about the Blackfires. But the Blackfires
it's very much in the background.
It's very much in the background. Yeah. It's a central part of explaining why this conflict is as it is.
Yes, it all kind of rides on the Blackfire Rebellion, so there you're starting to see how important it's going to be to the development of both Dunk and of Egg in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have basically this story. It shows you directly a Blackfire. It shows directly an attempt at starting a new rebellion. So this is a development that goes on, and from what we see in The World of Ice and Fire, from what George describes of the future of these characters, he very likely intends to show us more directly what happens when the Blackfire actually manages to get a rebellion going.
But there's a lot of things in the story, I think we could take that here as well, that all of a sudden are much more to the forefront. This has just been hinted at before. It's not just the Blackfires, it's things like, he's really hammering home the dragon dreams and all of that. All of a sudden he's got characters speaking about it rather openly. And so there are a lot of concepts that kind of he's pulled back on before, but now I guess with the stage where he's at with the main series, all of a sudden he's putting a lot of the information out there.
Yeah. And speaking of information, let's move on to sort of discussing the present situation we find the characters and what the lay of the land is. The story opens with us leaving a familiar location, and they leave Stony Sept. This is the place where Arya was, where the Battle of the Bells took place during Robert's Rebellion. Will take place during Robert's Rebellion. And so it's in the Riverlands. And the first thing we see is, there's a head on a spike, and they realize it's this poor Septon who was preaching against the king, against Bloodraven, preaching that they should, Daemon died, but he had 7 sons, and there's, across the sea, waiting to come back, and treason, and so this guy's killed for treason.
Interesting thing for a Septon to take up their cause.
Well, we have this with it in Clash of Kings and King's Landing when Twisted Little Monkey Demon is being preached against by a poor brother and so on.
Yeah, but taking up the Blackfire side of things. Because it would imply that he feels that does he feel that the king is godless mainly because of Bloodraven?
It's not godlessness. It's that partly it's because of Bloodraven.
Yes.
But I think it's also, you'll say that, he believes that by divine right, the intention was for Daemon to be king. He is the right king.
Yeah. He's a bastard. Usually Septons aren't
legitimized, however.
True, but still.
Let me just fix this here. And see, come over to the land. And they end up deciding to go on to, Dunk is already talking about going north, going to the wall, and they decide to they hear about this turning at White Walls. This fabulous new castle raised by Lord Butterwell, who was very wealthy and used to be very influential, used to be, hand to Daeron the Good until the Blackfire Rebellion, when he didn't handle it so well, and then, his grandfather before him had been hand to Aegon the Unworthy, and so he's open for these prizes, and that's really it. But the plot, what's the actual story? The actual story, is about an attempt at the Blackfire Rebellion, and this, for us, for readers, you kind of know right off kind of what's afoot, but for Egg and Dunk, it takes a while to put the pieces together.
It's true.
More so Dunk than
yes,
Egg.
in contrast to what we see in The Sword and Sword, where we kind of discover it along with them, more or less. We don't really get a sense ahead of time from Dunk and Egg what has happened in the background there, and the fact that they were on different sides in the Blackfire Rebellion. But here, yes, this is a case of the reader, I guess also because of the knowledge you have from the books.
Yes.
Starting to put things together much faster than the characters.
Yeah.
As I said,
we know,
Dunk,
going into this, we know there are, 5 Blackfire Rebellion, so we know that Blackfire Rebellion is lying in the future.
So he has to play with it in a different way. It can't just be things we just learn.
So let's talk about the meetings, because, this story initially builds on meetings, and we'll talk about the 2 different groups that they get to become acquainted with on the way to White Walls. First meeting on the road is a couple of lordlings and their entourages and this very curious hedge knight. The first of them, the chief of them, the oldest, clearly sort of the bossy one, is Lord Peak. He of the 3 castles on his shield, flinty-eyed guy, apparently a notable warrior, and initially Dunk doesn't quite twig, but it's Egg who fills him in on the fact that he...
Eventually he puts the pieces together and realizes that this is the Peak who killed Sir Arlen's previous squire.
Roger Penetri, yes.
So he's in fact responsible for Dunk being where he is. All his presence.
It has a nice little, at the end, a little coda at the end about that. But and also he killed the Hand, Lord Hayford, at the Redgrass Field. The Peaks, the 3 castles, were not just a nice device. They actually used to own 3 castles. Dunstanbury, Whitegrove, and Starpike. And now obviously Starpike, Peak, if you are a fantasy reader, you know about Gormenghast, and the Peaks here are a reference to the writer Mervyn Peake, who wrote the Gormenghast and Titus Groan. And Starpike is obviously reminiscent of Steerpike, who was sort of the main, one of the central characters of Gormenghast. I
tried reading those ones. We'll leave it at that.
I haven't actually got around to reading it.
I know George is very fond of them. They are...
The BBC miniseries on it was quite good. And Jonathan Rhys-Mears as Steerpike.
Yes, I can see. It does capture some of the aspects of the book that weren't so enjoyable.
Yeah, but so there's that reference. And so they had these castles, and they lost them. Well, they lost 2 of them. Starpike,
being on the wrong side.
We're being on the wrong side. That was the punishment. Gorman was apparently following in the footsteps of ancestors, because as the World Ice and Fire reveals, the Peaks were very ambitious, and there was a Peak who was very central to not so much central to the dance, although he had an important part to play in the Dance of Dragons, of switching sides when it suited him best. But he ended up becoming a regent and becoming a Hand, I believe, as well, until... Or Lord Protector, maybe.
Lord Protector, I think.
Yeah, and being extremely ambitious and trying to get the king to marry his daughter and all this stuff. It was quite eye-opening.
Did we get... we may have had to cut a lot of that. Obviously, it centered a lot on the regency of...
Aegon the Fifth. Aegon the Third. Sorry, Aegon the Third is the wrong.
Lots of interesting politics there, certainly, and quite a nasty piece of work, that Peak, and it doesn't seem like his descendants have improved that much.
And Peak's descendants themselves, Gorman Peak's descendants themselves, will also not be that great, because we learn later on that it is at the rebellion of the Peaks that leads to Maekar's death down the road, but this is in the future. So Peak is in the company of this young sort of lordling, Lord Alan Cockshaw, who's kind of very brusque and doesn't understand why we're wasting time talking to this hedge knight and his squire. But it seems kind of that this hedge knight, who introduced me as Sir John the Fiddler, and he has who's very well kept and fair and handsome.
Not your average hedge knight.
He doesn't act like any kind of hedge knight you ever met before. No. Peak is kind of deferring to him grudgingly. He gets to have his way. He's very glib, very mercurial, very chatty. I mean, he's very friendly. He's trying to get them to come along with him. Of course, this is Daemon the Younger, Daemon the Second.
Doing a really poor job of masquerading as a hedge knight.
Yes, it's a terrible job. And Dunk really
doesn't know what to make. No, he doesn't know what to make of it. It's like, what is this thing? I mean, and he can't, he's not the sharpest guy around, and politics is not really his thing, so he can't really, but something's definitely not right. The way he's talking, the way he's acting, the way the interactions are with the other lords, this is it just doesn't add up. And I think you can get the sense of Egg at his side sort of just going, this just isn't right.
And then there's a second set of meetings, because they can't really travel in the company of it doesn't quite feel right, and they end up coming across someone more of her class, some hedge knights. And Sir Kyle the Cat of Misty Moor, who's an older man, but still, Sir Maynard Plum, and a Sir Glendon Ball, and there seems to be a hesitation about that last name. Now, Kyle is a pretty straightforward hedge knight trying to find someone to become a sworn man to, and have a roof over his head and so on. Much like Dunk was doing in the Sworn Sword.
Turns out he has a brilliant plan.
It's not a terrible plan.
It's not a terrible plan, but it kind of goes the way of one of Baldric's cunning plans.
It doesn't work out so well.
No.
Because obviously he used to be in the service of Lord Caswell, and Lord Caswell's heir was a young boy at the time. And he knew him, and he said, I made him his first, wooden sword, and so when we go to attorney and hopefully we'll joust against one another, not I'll deliberately lose. And then remind him of making that sword, and surely he'll welcome you back with open arms. And unfortunately, it doesn't work out so well for him, because the Lord, Lord Castle doesn't really remember, saying, "Why would I want such a feeble knight as you?"
Yeah.
Ouch. So it's a shame, but Sir Glendon, let's go to him now. He's much more complicated. He's this angry brusque young man who has a fireball on his shield, because he claims he is the son of Fireball. Fireball was one of the great knights and heroes of the Blackfire Rebellion. He was, in fact, the master at arms at the Red Keep, the man who apparently taught Daemon Blackfire and Baylor Breakspear how to fight, who was promised a place in Kingsguard by Aegon the Unworthy, was denied that place, ended up
having put his wife away as a
silent sister
to make himself eligible, and then he didn't get that place.
Because
ambitious.
Very ambitious. Well, very desirous of a Kingsguard honor, anyways. And that
not so desirous of his wife.
That turns him against Daemon, or against Daeron, and towards Daemon. And it's suggested that he was instrumental. I mean, it's such instrumental in getting Daemon to escape arrest when rumor of his plans to proclaim reached his half-brother. So Fireball was a very significant figure, and the story goes, on the eve of the Redgrass Field battle, there was a camp follower named Jenny, known as Penny Jenny.
Yeah.
Who Now the story goes...
Didn't she earn that name after?
No, Penny Jenny, I think then became Redgrass Jenny after.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right, because she entertained so many of the soldiers.
That's the thing. I mean, might be that this Jenny did sleep with Fireball, but she slept with a lot of other men.
Yeah.
Fireball, of course, died under curious circumstances, lifting off his helmet to get a drink of water from a stream. And
it must have been later that evening, because he was supposed to be on the eve of the battle that he dies, actually.
Something like that.
Doesn't actually that make it very unlikely that he also had time to sleep with Penny Jenny?
It's a mystery to me. Who knows? But he dies an arrow from Viserys. Some people wonder if it was Bloodraven's men or Bloodraven himself who did it. But regardless,
some random common archer who was never found. I think it
happens.
Yeah,
it happens. And you know, lifting it. George always is big on the helmets. And if you listen to the commentaries at Game of Thrones and Blackwater, George is big on the fact that guys should have their helmets on. So we learn more about the story later on. Initially, he doesn't really know this. He just knows that, I'm the son of...
Yeah.
And then later, eventually, he shows up at the tourney, and then they're calling him Sir Glendon Flowers, a knight of Pussy Willows, because the Pussy Willow is the brothel or the inn where the prostitutes and his mother were. It's a very scandalous story where he works in the stables, he loves horses, he's a skilled horseman, and he has his head full of his idea that he's the son of a hero. And it makes him, he manages to get someone to teach him the basics of fighting, and he turns out to be an excellent jouster and very fierce.
One of those naturals. Obviously, you can sort of go with the idea, does he really have, maybe he's got some, excellent blood in his lineage.
Yeah, I mean, he's like 16 or something, but he's stocky and strong. He's not handsome, as I recall. No. He's kind of a pug-nosed and kind of very common looking, but he's
really one of those prodigies.
Prodigy. And the story goes that a knight and a company of knights came by. I think it was Morgan Dunstable, comes along and is interested in his maiden sister, who will eventually become another prostitute. But she, at the time, she's still a maiden, and they had quite expensive to get a virgin. And apparently he negotiates and says, well, you can have my sister and deflower her if you knight me. And
was he able, it also kind of makes it odd, was he able to basically, was he sort of holding his sister's purse, so to speak, or was it, they were both residing at the...
They were residing there, they were working there clearly, and she was being obviously groomed for...
Yes, but it's all that, there must have been some interest, I think, from... If he must have been liked by, whoever was running the brothel for him to take, unite him, and then we can agree on the price for his sister. Because I don't think he had the necessarily means to...
Well, that's interesting. I never really thought about that. We don't know who owned the inn or the brothel. We don't know how that works, but we have to assume in some fashion, or that he promised the person I'd make it up to you or something, and So that's the story, and of course that makes him very angry to hear himself called Flowers. I mean, because Flowers, at least, they're acknowledging the claim that he's a bastard son of somebody.
A bastard son of a noble.
Of a noble.
Or something.
So that's something.
It's true. But, then adding of Pussy Willows,
the gossip gets around, and he's... of course, in the tourney, he turns out to be very good and very dangerous. The last person, Sir Maynard Plum, is a person that, he seems to be, very fair-haired, tall, kind of slender guy, a bit curious how he's in the company, and he's after the, he plans to go to White Walls just like everyone else, because and Egg wonders, are you related to Lord Viserys Plum? And he says, well, distantly, although, you may not care to... Technology Association and okay, Viserys, to see. Well, we have to go back to Baelor the Blessed.
Yes.
And
his three sisters in the Maiden Vault.
In the Maiden Vault. One of them, the youngest, being Elena Targaryen, one of the princesses in the tower, who
ends up marrying a lot of people.
Yes,
she goes through quite a few husbands once she gets out of the Maiden Vault.
But her... And not just husbands, she had lovers as well.
Yes.
But her first husband was Lord Ossifer Plum. And if you remember Ossifer Plum mentioned in the books, he was the lord of the 6-foot cock.
Yes.
And
not because there was any gossip about him being fabulously well endowed, but because Elena manages to get knocked up on their wedding night, but most likely poor Sir Ossifer, Lord Ossifer, had expired before the act took place, presumably at the sight of his wife's naked body. Hence the 6-foot cock for, having managed the deed from 6 foot under.
Yeah.
I believe it's Aegon. No, it's not Aegon being blamed, of course. It's, is it Alan?
No. Aegon.
It is Aegon, yes. He had a thing for Baelor's sisters.
Now we're back after having dealt with Breeze rummaging around in our trash. So Ossifer, obviously with Ossifer dead and her knocked up, but then it was claimed that this was it was his son, obviously, so that she could claim the lands and so on. So
they claim that the Plums have some, more than a bit of Targaryen blood. They would obviously have it from Elena, but not a double dose from having Aegon.
That's Daemon Blackfire as the other.
Yes, this is true.
Example of a bastard of Aegon has a double dose.
Yep. Another sister of Baelor's.
Yeah, Dana the Defiant. I believe this is also the point where. I don't know. That's later. Never mind. One thing about this meeting with the Hedge Knights, and he falls in their company, and they end up traveling together, is it reminds me of another questing sort of knight, questing warrior, coming across a group of Hedge Knights who share their friendship and their fire, and they kind of travel together. And this is the start of Peter Crow's Reign of Tarth, falling in with Sir Creighton Longbow and Illithur the Penniless. Yeah. The company of the road.
It definitely has echoes of that.
And I think it's deliberate. Well, that's something for a bit later. Let's move on to discussing the scene of the main scene of this is White Walls, this fabulous castle of Lord Butterwell's. So this grand event is the wedding of Lord Butterwell to his bride, a daughter of Lord Frey. Now, as I said, Butterwell was once master of coin to Daeron the Good, to Aegon the Unworthy, while his grandfather was Hand, and then he became Hand to Daeron. Now, during the Blackfire Rebellion, he was a bit skeevy.
Yes, indeed.
He sent one son to fight for Daemon. He had one son to fight for Daeron. He himself didn't do much of a good job of dealing with the rebellion. In fact, it's noted he didn't fight at all. He kind of excused himself.
Yeah.
So people claim that he was a traitor, and he was basically doing the Lord Swan during the War
I'll
of the
try
Five Kings.
to keep good with both sides, so whichever wins, I'll probably get away with it.
The bride is not really a great catch. I mean, okay, it's a daughter of Lord Frey. Now the Freys are kind of up-jumped. They're not an old family, but they're wealthy, they're influential. Unfortunately, she's a bit soiled. She's not a virgin. She got caught in flagrante with a kitchen boy, and I think allegedly the story goes they were covered in head to toe in flour when someone.
Yes. It kind of makes you think of another Frey girl there, doesn't it?
Gatehouse Amy, yes. Someone discovered them.
Yes, indeed, and raised a ruckus over it. The little, was he 5 or something?
5 or so.
Grandson at the time.
No, son of...
Yeah,
yeah.
Right. A little Walder Frey.
Son and heir.
Yes, a little snot-nosed Frey heir.
Yep, that is Walder. Causing trouble, getting way too interested in what the doings between men and women, apparently.
Yes, I guess that's... he made good use of that knowledge, starting his career.
Now, the main draw to tourney, of course, is the Dragon's Egg. The grand prize, the Dragon's Egg that Aegon the Unworthy gave to Butterwell's grandfather. And the story for this is more of this sort of licentious...
It's kind of full of that, between, Glendon's backstory, Glendon's knighting, the Frey bride, and then, yes, the dragon's egg, because the story is, and one has to presume, given that the dragon egg is there, that it was right. Aegon the Unworthy visited their old castle, I guess, must have been.
Yeah.
And the Lord and his 3 maiden daughters. When Aegon left the next day, there were no maiden daughters left in the household. Don't quite remember.
Allegedly, it's claimed that they were all pregnant.
Yes, as well. They're not mentioned as among the great bastards, and
these are stories that we don't really know.
But anyway, he's supposed to have given a dragon's egg to. It's not clear whether he gave the egg to Lord Butterwell before sleeping with the daughters as payment, or if he gave it afterwards as a recompense, or I had a great time staying at your castle, love to do it again.
Now obviously don't cast doubts on this whole story. He says, if you believe half the stories about Aegon and Worthy, we'd all be bastards, and Maynard Plum quips, "Oh, who's to say we aren't?"
Yes.
We'll get into that later. At White Walls, we meet Butterwell, we meet Lord Frey, who's kind of an elegant kind of guy, who clearly clever, and Black Tom Heddle, who's sort of captain of the guard for Lord Butterwell, who's actually noted to be one of the fiercer warriors present, because there's a handful of
interesting last name there, of course.
Heddle, yes. We obviously meet the long. Jenny, or is it Jane? Long Jane Heddle and Masha Heddle, who ran the Crossroads Inn. Obviously, relation to the Heddle knight who was injured and ended up becoming the first, kind of taking over the Crossroad Inn. There was a whole question, of course, as to where, when they travel. This is getting into very stuff. They travel 5-6 days from Stony Sept when they come to this lake where there's a ferry. And 5-6 days actually fits how long approximately people on horseback should take to get to the God's Eye. But you'd think if it was the God's Eye, that they would say it's the biggest lake in the 7 Kingdoms. You'd think they'd mention that. The other thing is that people point out, well, the ferry is supposed to just take an hour each way, right?
It seems far too little for that.
It seems too little to cross the whole of the God's Eye. Now, I point out, it's possible that it's some spur where that it's quicker to cross by a boat than it is to ride around. The whole thing is kind of complicated by the fact that the description it has of it is that it has it's built on sort of a what do you call? I'm blanking on the term for
the ferry, or
where you build up a building on what are the big pools? What are those pools called?
That's a really good question.
I wish I remember what it was. I'm gonna kick myself because it's one of those I have it on the tip of my tongue and I can't wait. But it's built up like that, right on the water's edge or leaning into the water. And we're told that the Crossroad Inn used to be just like that. There was a ferry to get you across to White Walls, but it wasn't a lake, it was the river, right? And then the river, just like the Mississippi does, it ended up shifting away from it, so now it's dry. So it's the only other thing I can think of is that George intended to say river, and not lake. Yeah. We actually saw the Mystery Night early, but because at the time, we didn't.
So an hour to cross a river is.
Well, it's the Trident.
Yeah.
It is a big river.
True.
That would fit.
It would fit the speed of a ferry better, yeah.
They would fit. So it's a bit odd that we have this lake. But in any case, and there's a nice detail, speaking of the Crossroad Inn, which I'll bring up at the very end of this whole series, because so Black Tom Heddle is there. He's kind of the right-hand man. And then there's this Sir Uther Underleaf. And he's an interesting figure. He's got a snail. He's a hedge knight.
We see some interesting different takes on hedge knights in.
Yes.
We've seen it before as well with Brown Bennus being a really unsavory type. But here we see some hedge knights who go to tourneys and who
as
have...
a career.
As a career. And
tourney
also
knights,
have different approaches to how they want to...
This is obviously drawing on the actual tourney circuits of the Middle Ages, in which you had, I mean, there wasn't a formal circuit per se, but there were tourneys all the time, and you know, starting on from like the 12th century, and you would have some knights who made their careers of their fortunes traveling. The most famous of them being William Marshall. William Marshall partnered with another knight and said, you know, we'll split our earnings and we'll, you know, fight together in these melees and so on. And Uther Underleaf is kind of underhanded because his whole thing is, I make no waves. I don't let anyone know who I am, and I try and stay really quiet. I don't have singers coming after me, extolling my virtues.
He's got a snail on his shield.
Yeah, he downplays himself as much as possible.
I mean, Dunk falls for it.
Dunk absolutely falls for it. He's a small guy.
A guy with a snail on his shield, you know.
So must be slow. And he kicks his butt. And the whole thing for him is he says, you know, he wagers on things as well, and he tries to get people to bet against him. He tries to build up other people to make them seem as good as possible. He underperforms when in practices to kind of
just... So for him to get a match against, you know, the very large Dunk, you know, that was great for him. He won stuff on the wagers because people figured, of course, that the big guy is gonna beat the little fella with the snail
and now let's move on to the central sort of twist in the story where everything kind of goes pear-shaped, I guess. And what is going on in fact in Whitewall. Egg's been noticing that a lot of the people, the tourney, are people who fought for the Black Dragon.
Yes. There are various bits and pieces that don't quite add up. I said he's noticing, he's kind of starting to bring it up to Dunk. You know, those were on that side and they were on that side. And then I said there are some other oddities as well, like the, you know, the big price of the dragon's egg,
this weird hedge knight John the Fiddler.
Yeah, the bride who's not much of a catch really, and it turns out that the whole thing is a pretext.
Well, okay, Lord Butterwell does need a bride because his two sons who fought, but he sent on either side, they died in the fighting. Yeah. And his youngest, who didn't fight at all, ended up dying in the spring, aka during this Great Spring Sickness. Yeah. And so he did need a bride, he did need heirs. But, you know, and the wedding feast goes on well enough. Entertainments, a troop of dwarves doing funny things, echoes of, you know, later of the Storm of Swords and Joffrey's wedding. There's a toast to the king, and where Glendon tips over his cup for everyone. He's firmly a Blackfire supporter. After drinking too much, you know, Dunk goes out to relieve himself, and he hears this weird conversation, and he can't quite identify who it is, but he later realizes it's Black Tom Heddle and Gorman Peak arguing about something to do with, it sounds like, Bittersteel and the Golden Company, and why aren't they supporting this guy? Because is it going to really work? And one of them is like really saying it has to work, and
it's rather careless of them.
It is careless of them.
To have a blatantly traitorous conversation without, you know, making absolutely sure they should have probably headed out into the woods or something.
Yeah, it is maybe intentionally saying something about, from George saying something about how, because I mean the whole thing is, okay, so this is Daemon Blackfire, and this whole thing is this elaborate pretext. Shades of what we're told in The World of Ice and Fire that Harrenhal was. A pretext for meeting a people opposed to the king.
They needed the marriage, or Butterwell wanted the marriage anyway, but here you could get a lot of people together. I mean, it's interesting when we noted that, you know, like the Ashford tourney was very big and had all these people showing up.
Notable knights.
And I mean, here they're trying specifically to get a particular gathering of people together, and they have the dragon's egg as a prize, which sort of explains, so it kind of makes you wonder about other large tourneys. Are there all pretexts for plotting?
Well, the thing is, I mean, Uther says, I mean, for the most part, I mean, there's almost a sense that loyalists stayed away because they kind of felt something was off about this. Because none of the really great lords show up for this one, despite the fact
despite the prize.
Despite the prize, I mean, the dragon's egg is a big thing. But here you have all these mostly river lords in the area, but you know, a few other like Peak and so on. Now, so why? The whole thing is Daemon has come across the sea to proclaim and start a second rebellion, and yet he lacks the Golden Company and he lacks Bitter Steel. Bitter Steel is really important. I mean, he helped get the Sons away.
And he also lacks the sword.
And he lacks the sword. Now the sword is an interesting one because I believe, as I recall, the sword is not mentioned in the initial conversation.
No, that's an interesting one. There's actually a little bit of an error on George's part, or if it's supposed to be a misremembering of Dunk's. That's an odd misremembering because basically the sword isn't mentioned, and then when Dunk recalls the collection, they talk about how he doesn't have the sword.
I have a big recollection when we first saw the story, because we saw it before it was published. It did have a mention of Blackfire initially, and then it got removed for some reason, maybe because, but then they forgot to remove it.
The second,
So in any case, why isn't Bitter Steel? Now, I came to a realization that sort of, okay, the first thing is Daemon is absolutely sure that he's going to become king. Because he's seen it. He's seen it in his dreams. He's a dreamer. He has dragon dreams like Daemon the Drunken. And Daenus the Dreamer and so on. He has prophetic visions, and he has seen an egg being hatched. He's seen Sir Duncan as Lord Commander of the King's Guard. He's certain that it will work.
Bitter Steel seems to have less of a faith
Bitter Steel seems in that sort of thing, and that kind of confidence.
And especially, you know, Daemon is, you can kind of tell that he wouldn't really get along with a guy like Bitter Steel.
No, he is kind of, I guess you might say, a Renly-like figure in the sense that he is charming and very he doesn't take things very seriously, because he goes through life absolutely sure that he knows his destiny, and so he treats everything like a bit of a, like it doesn't matter, he's gonna manage anyways.
Everything very lightly, you know, this is just gonna, and he basically thinks, you get this, you know, like he thought he could just waltz in there and basically say, hi, you know, I'm Daemon Blackfire, let's, you know, go and take over King's Landing. He really doesn't have any concerns about keeping things quiet. So, you know,
he just thinks it's destined. He thinks he's absolutely, so part of it is his plan is risky, and he is thinking it's going to work for sure. And, you know, another aspect is the fact that the kind of person he is, in terms of, he's, for one thing, okay, one of the things that gets revealed as we go to the tournament is that Gorman Peak has been paying off people as needed to make sure they lose. He wants to guarantee that Daemon wins, because the whole thing hinges on him winning with the egg and then unveiling himself. The problem is that, and people said, oh, well, Daemon must have been pretty poor. Like, you know, this again has shades of the Hedge Knight, where Valar, he's a champion, but all the best knights avoid him. Only like the old knights and you know, middling knights dare to challenge him. And George has admitted, I mean, he admitted in an old story, right, if you read between the lines, like, everyone was going out of their way to make Valar look good because they didn't want to annoy his father. It was just kind of,
you don't want to get it good with his father, or which is kind of odd. He wouldn't really look.
No, Baelor Breaker wouldn't, but people, that's how people are thinking. They don't want to,
you know, you don't want to risk something when it's a Targaryen.
Yeah. So Daemon's actually, and I'll say this, Daemon is actually a good jouster, because one of the people he jousts is Galtree of Green, who is a local jouster of note. Not like, you know, he's not a Jaime Lannister, but he's good, you know. And they break a number of lances, and it's, you don't do that. And Galtree can't set himself up to make sure that they just break lances against one another, you know. He can't guide the lance for Daemon. So Daemon is pretty good, but he's not great.
I mean, he's a good horseman, I think we see that.
Yeah, he's not necessarily good enough to guarantee a win. He's not a Laura Cyril. He's not a Leo Longthorn. He's a good jouster, but he's not a great one.
Yeah.
I'm trying to recall how I got onto this whole jousting angle.
I think talking about the sort of person that Damon is and why Bitter Steel.
So the other thing, and now this is a big one, is his sexuality was there was a lot of arguments about this. Now, I admit, when I read the story, I mean, the stuff that he says to Dunk is, can be read as the most outrageous possible flirtation. I mean, he's really drunk, and he's telling him all these things, and I argued very strongly against, but you can take it as that. Yeah. I left up, I mean, the question is there, but, my problem was it felt very, a very negative stereotype of a homosexual man. That he's throwing himself at this guy who he knows nothing about and thinks that he can just have him, and it didn't make sense to me. I felt like it was such a terrible stereotype. George wouldn't do that. So I think George didn't necessarily intend you to read him as, for certainly homosexual. And yes, Alan Cockshaw turns out to be jealous of Dunk because of the interest, but he wants to be Lord Commander of the Kingsguard himself. Shades of the Fireball thing there. And it's clear that he loves Damon. But they were children together, and he wept when he learned that Damon was coming back, or when they were parted. But they were children, and this pre-sexual, prepubescent children. They were. I mean, his elder brothers were, I think, 11 or 12, the twins, Aegon and Aemon. So he's 10 or something, 9, 10. Well, probably 10 because of the fact that Damon had 7 kids. One after the other.
Yeah, interesting, by the way, there we get a little bit of an insight into the twins as well.
Yes, from Cockshaw, that they were bullies. Yeah. They were not nice kids. Damon was, he was artistic. He was, he played music. He dreamed. He was that kind, and they were a bit more rough and tumble, a bit more warlike, I guess. But the thing I have realized very recently is this. It all hinges on his dreams and his certainty. Yes. He is certain. He has dreamed it. He knows it will be true. Dunk will have the white cloak. Yeah. He will look splendid in it. He will become Lord Commander. Yeah. Well, since I'm going to be king, and I would never appoint someone to be my Lord Commander who wasn't my lover, obviously we're destined to become lovers. So this wild flirtation suddenly clicks for me, because this is all a piece.
I hadn't thought of it like that. That's an interesting way.
Suddenly,
I can definitely see, as in that it has to do with. I think I don't know if it necessarily. I can buy that. I don't know if it's necessary to explain his behavior, though, because I think all of his personality can be explained with this certainty that if he thinks that. If he's seen a connection between himself and some person, well, then I don't think it's necessarily him thinking, well, I wouldn't appoint somebody as Lord Commander who wasn't my lover. It's but, well, of course we're going to have a connection, and, I'm sure we're going to hit it off fabulously.
Yeah.
And he's probably previously had, perhaps, dreams. I don't know if you have random dreams about less significant things, but he might have had other things that have come through for him like that, and he just has a way of assuming that things will just fall out the way he's seen it, and that's it. And he probably doesn't have a lot of things, not go his way.
Yeah.
Because he's been on this path all the time. And but yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But certainly his absolute certainty in his destiny has very much shaped his personality.
Indeed. I think it makes a lot of sense to have someone who believes they know exactly how the future is going to be laid out for them.
No problem. I've got this. I've seen it.
And obviously then the idea is Peake is so blinded by his grievances of losing his castles that he's chancing this thing because he doesn't want Bitter Steel's timetable. Bitter Steel is being an old woman. He's refusing to push forward. He wants it now.
Cautious, the try one is a better opportunity.
The wedding feast is, Dunk returns, and then it's time for the bedding, and Dunk ends up the task of carrying the maid who's not entirely naked. She has a stocking, I believe, left on her foot, and he sees the egg, and really is very impressed. Now, this egg, there was some debate: is this the egg that Drogon is hatched from, because it's this red and black. But Daddy very clearly describes Drogon's egg as being predominantly black with scarlet whorls. This was actually predominantly red. Linda was wondering if we can figure out who it was hatched, who it came from.
We get some details. I don't, again, remember quite how much made it into the World of Ice and Fire, for example.
I don't think that egg is ever mentioned anyways.
Because we are able to match up one egg from history with one of Dany's eggs, most likely.
Yeah.
Although I don't even remember if that it is from George's description of the egg given to Princess Elena, because it matched her hair being cream with a gold streak, and she had silver with a gold streak in her hair.
Yeah.
And that very much matches the description of Viserion's egg.
Yes, it does.
Oh, and the way the dragon. So, yeah, but this one doesn't quite seem to match. If it matches with the egg's color, and this should be a red dragon.
Then he wants to get close to the egg and take a closer look, and then Black Tom Heddle tells him off not to touch it.
That's where he recognizes
that he was one of the people. Yeah. And so let's go to the tournament. At the tournament, now the Mystery Knights, we actually kind of have two Mystery Knights here, because one of them is the false John the Fiddler. And then we have Doug himself, who his shield is actually touching on the sword. He lost, his shield was splintered to pieces by Lucas Inchfield, Inch, when they were fighting, and so he ended up buying a new one and hadn't had time to repaint it, and it just had a knight or a figure hanging from a gallows. Yeah. And he decided, well, let's enter me as the Gallows Knight. Now, this actually fits. George has had Mystery Knights mentioned before. Simon Toyne, the outlaw, was supposed to have entered a tourney as a Mystery Knight. Barristan the Bold was a Mystery Knight as a 10-year-old. They're very popular figures. Now, historically, and now let's get into the actual Middle Ages. The concept of knights entering in sort of costumes and disguises existed,
but in a different way.
In a different way. Even though you weren't really disguising yourself, everyone knew who you were, but it was all part of. And I mean,
the pageantry.
The pageantry of it. So there was a tourney where knights came in as savages of the woods, and or knights of the Round Table. They kind of did this whole thing.
They're cosplaying.
And
or women.
In fact, one of the more famous examples of that is Ulrich von Liechtenstein. If you remember that name, that is the basis for, very, very loosely, the basis for Heath Ledger's character in A Knight's Tale, which, as we discussed when we were discussing The Hedge Knight, that George actually said they can't make a Hedge Knight movie because A Knight's Tale is kind of very similar concept. Ulrich von Liechtenstein was famous. He had an autobiography, and he was a famous jouster who traveled around jousting, and said, in his, he was presided over a tournament as King Arthur, and he had this is German, so the Venusfahrt, where he went around challenging knights dressed up as the goddess Venus. In fact, there's a lot of this. In fact, I found a fascinating academic piece discussing about transvestitism in the Middle Ages, and saying one of the places that a lot of scholars miss, because there's not a lot of evidence of men dressing as women, or especially women dressing as men. There was lots of sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws that prevented this sort of thing, but he said a lot of scholars have missed the fact that you had a heck of a lot of it in the pageantry of tournaments, where you had knights dressing as women just because. So the actual idea
George has missed something there, clearly.
The actual idea of mystery knights proper, of men who come in and disguise and use their armor to have anonymity, that, as far as I can tell, is entirely an invention of Sir Walter Scott in Ivanhoe. What was the name that he used?
Desticado.
Yes.
The disinherited knight, or something like that, I think. Yes, when Ivanhoe comes in at a great tournament and hides who he is, obviously. He doesn't want anyone to know that he has returned from the Crusades. And,
And I mean, I know for sure George has seen the 50s film. I'm sure he's generally aware. He's probably read it, but he knows that one. And sorry, the movie was influential for him as a
Let's
kid.
talk about how many times I've seen the later 80s.
Sam Neill, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I like the A&E or maybe originally BBC one with Steve Waddingham, I think.
That was a miniseries, right?
Yeah, that was a good one. I like that.
But they used to show the 80s version every Christmas here.
Yeah.
That's a kind of
So you had various people jousting. John the Fiddler does well. The Snails. I don't know if is Junk his first opponent. I can't remember.
I think so.
Yeah, so he doesn't really know what to play. But let's pass that. But Glendon does really well. But later on, he's like he defeated one knight, and he was really looking forward to the ransom, and the fellow basically refused to pay a ransom to a bastard, a low-born bastard type or whatever, and deliberately ruined his armor. And said, I'm not going to pay you any ransom. Here's my ruined armor. And I think he refused to give him the horse, as well as say he'd sooner kill it than give it to him. So he's not, but he's doing really well.
That's a very stuck-up guy.
Yeah. Now Dunk ends up losing to a snail.
Yes.
In fact, he gets hit very hard on the head, is out of it. Dunk later goes to him to try and sort out the whole situation because he doesn't have the money to pay the ransom for the armor and the horse. And he's trying to figure out something honorable, some way to... And the guy tells him, well, I've got this idea.
That's where he tells him about the whole...
his whole scheme.
Whole scheme, and now he wants Dunk on board. They can go to various tourneys.
Small tourneys, yeah.
And... pretend not to know each other, and he's going to get great odds fighting this big guy.
Dunk should grow an unruly beard, and he'll present him as some sort of savage knight, and then I'll end up winning, and we'll rake it in. And after a dozen of these or so, we'll call the debt settled, and I'll teach you jousting because you very obviously need a few lessons. Dunk can't; he's too dishonorable. He can't really accept that.
He's not a very practical fellow, Dunk. He's honorable, but not very practical.
Of course, the other thing that he'll end up revealing is that someone tried to off him.
True.
Someone paid him to kill Dunk. But the money, it was, I think it was like 5 gold dragons or something, and he felt it was too little to kill a man, so he took the money, but he didn't kill him. Who was it? He was some serving man, anonymous figure. He doesn't know who it belongs to, but someone clearly dislikes Dunk. More about that later. Let me see this guy. And then they're getting to the point where the trouble really starts. Let's break there and start on to a new section because that's the next phase of the story. For the next phase, Glendon's been doing really well, and then word starts running around the egg's been stolen. The egg's gone. And Gorman Peak and Black Tom Heddle seem to have their suspicions, and the next thing they know is we found it. It was in Glendon Flowers' saddlebags. He had stolen it. So they seize him, beat him, and drag him away. And this is all mystifying. I mean, and Glendon's like, why would I steal it? I was going to win this bloody tourney. I was going to win it myself.
It doesn't make a lot of sense.
It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's kind of where it goes. And at the same time, there's a bit of a problem because Egg's kind of gone missing at the same time, and so Doug's asking around like, "Hey, have you seen Egg? Like, where is he?" Egg,
not the egg.
Yeah, no.
Yes. Well, the two eggs on the loose, basically. But yes, I mean, this happens while Dunk is out cold, I guess. Or is Egg there? No, he's missing when Dunk wakes up, isn't he?
I can't.
No, he's not.
No, he's not. No.
Because they talk about ransoming, getting the horse ready for ransoming, and Egg gets upset about that and doesn't want to hand over the horse. And
so it's all very complicated and messed up. And then,
but it's after Dunk has gone to talk to the snail, and then And then after, I guess, he tells Egg to bring him the armor and the horse and so on. At some point after there...
Egg wanders off
for some reason.
Yeah. And while he's looking around for him, he gets attacked. He gets attacked by Alan Cockshaw out of nowhere, who reveals... Tries to tell him to jump into the well and has a knife on him and to kill him. And basically, he's the one who paid the person, because as we said earlier, he is in love with Damon, or very infatuated with him, and he wants to be the war commander of his Kingsguard and probably his lover.
Yes, and
maybe.
He doesn't, and his Damon's interest in Dunk is a clear problem for him.
Yeah, so he wants to kill, and Dunk turns the table on him and throws him down the well instead. He gets cut, I believe. Cockshaw's dead, and Plum is a spy, and you know, when he shows up, the other thing I forgot to mention is you know, it's raining, it's wet, and Plum shows up, and initially there's this hooded shape with like a single pale white eye coming at him, and then Duncan, it's a man and a shadowed face and a hood, and that's Maynard Plum, and that's just it's the moonstone brooch pinning his cloak and whatever. And so he goes off to the Sept, and there at the Sept he finds
Egg and a very nervous Lord Butterwell. It turns out that Egg, who was very upset about Dunk's career as a knight possibly coming to an end because he wouldn't be able to ransom back his armor,
and the
horse in particular. Egg is very attached to Thunder, and he had to go and hand him over to the snail, and he's upset. So he has decided to go ahead and do what he'd asked Dunk about before, but not gotten permission to do, namely use his boots, where he's got his royal seal, or his signet ring.
His father's signet.
His father's signet ring. So he goes and shows that to the castle's maester to send a raven to his father and, basically have him sort out Dunk's predicament. He doesn't want, because he wants to be able to stay a squire for Dunk, and he feels that, this one time we can cheat and not go about it like
proper hedge knight.
Hedge knights who wouldn't have that out. Well, the castle maester kind of freaks at that.
Yeah, here's a royal prince or somebody with the seal.
Yes,
and takes him.
And we're in the middle of a rebellion here, or setting up a rebellion.
Yeah.
So he takes him to Lord Butterwell,
and who at the time is with Lord Frey, by the way, and where. And Egg tells him, I thought I'd tell him that I had stole the ring, but then I recalled something that my father said, Bloodraven said once, it's better to be frightening than frightened. So
he decides to go all out with the, I guess he has these things kind of floating around in the back of his head. The oddity is he's there to spy.
Yeah.
To check up on things, because you've got all these people who were on the wrong side in the
it looks suspicious, and so they're suspicious, and I'm a spy for for Prince Maekar, and you better let us go, and you better put that, you better stop your treason, or you're gonna lose your head.
He doesn't know for sure that there is treason. He just had, there's enough here that I can probably get away with bullying, and Butterwell kind of goes, oh, good.
And Frey says, oh, I wish you happiness in your marriage, and takes off, basically.
Like a Frey.
So, Butterwell goes to the Sept to start praying and kind of, oh my god, what am I going to do? And Butterwell, when Dunk comes in, it's like immediately, this wasn't my idea. Tom Heddle and
he's
Pete.
ready to throw in the towel and give them all the names they want. He's like, the worst co-conspirator you could have.
Yeah, he was unwilling. He was completely unwilling. He didn't want to participate in this, and it was all against his will. And then Black Tom Heddle arrives and sees the boy, and Butterwell says, "Don't touch him. You can't touch him, Tomard." He's his son-in-law, I think, as well. So, yeah. And is that right? Yeah, I think so. And
he's not really inclined to listen.
He's not inclined to listen. And some of us don't have milk in our veins, He
realized. Butterwell seems to think that he can get out of things again the way he got out of things the last time.
He was not. He was being a very soft participant. He wasn't like a main conspirator. But... And
Heddle obviously knows that this is it. We're dead men
But seizing a hold of a prince and all that will be, of course. I presume then the maester went and told them that this kid. So they're seizing the
yes, yeah.
So. Dunk fights Heddle and reveals, I told you I'm better with a sword than I am with a lance, and kills him. I think it chopped off his hand or something first, or his arm, and then...
I think something like that, yeah. Again, he's using his strength and being the type of fighter that, Dunk can manage to be, rather than the skilled jouster with precision.
And then we have, after this, there's the whole business of Daemon. Daemon has now dressed in probably regal finery and is ready to rally these people through a rebellion. When Dunk says, he cast out, let us see the egg. Did you really have it by right? And is Glendon really guilty? And the egg turns out to not be an egg at all. It's a rock.
Stone, yeah.
It's a painted stone, which first says the egg was stolen, but they have no idea who stole it. And because the symbol of the egg is so important to this idea of his plot, but he has to have it. That Peake basically faked it, pinned it on someone because he didn't know who he had to pin it on somebody.
And it was a good idea to pin it on Glendon, because I think, hadn't they tried to bribe him and he refused?
That's the big issue, actually. That's one of the big problems for him, was the fact that Glendon...
They had to get him out of the way, because he's clearly...
not going to take a payoff.
He's not going to take a payoff. He's, much too, stubborn and honourable in that sense, and, clearly much too good.
Yeah. And he's been tortured and things. His fingers are mangled, and basically Dunk gets Daemon to do the kingly chivalrous thing and say he can have a trial by combat. He's a knight. Yeah. He can test his guilt or innocence in the jousting fields.
There Dunk is smart. He reads Daemon right.
Exactly right. Daemon, of course, the grand gesture of a chivalrous. That's the kind of guy he is. He's not...
and it'll be fabulous when I win and prove I'm right, rather than the tournament kind of got didn't get a proper ending because of the theft of the egg. Now I can finally put this right, and everyone's gonna follow me, and we'll sort this matter out.
Yeah, it doesn't quite turn that way.
No.
Daemon, the second of his name, becomes the brown dragon.
Yes,
he gets thrown in the...
It's rained a bit.
In the mud. And the thing is, the thing is almost painful when Glendon says, why did he do this to me? I would have followed him.
That's the thing.
He is a loyalist of the Blackfires. He would have followed him.
He thinks he's Fireballs' son. He's convinced he's Fireballs' son. And, we've already seen... it's all that they didn't pick up on, that Daemon didn't pick up on that, and
his loyalty, yes.
In loyalty when he wouldn't toast,
because he's this not handsome, low-born, up-jumped knight of dubious quality and
but he completely misses that.
Yeah,
and because Glendon would have been quite the supporter to have on board.
No, he really was. It was painful. He really would have followed him, and he's gutted by the time, but it's ended up this way because all he wanted was to fulfill his father's legacy, and put a Blackfire on the throne. That's what he wanted at the time.
Yeah.
He's young and idealistic, and he just sees things in a certain way. So, but he wins, and in the end, people start laughing at him, at Daemon, and when Daemon. And the thing is, when
Daemon's still convinced as well.
The thing is, when Egg tells, there's an army, my father's leading an army, well, he's not quite right. His father isn't leading an army. However, an army is coming, and it's a big army, and it's being led by Bloodraven. And there are lords from the Crown Lands. There's Mad Danelle Lofston, with her red hair streaming behind her, wearing armor.
Yeah.
Lord Blackwood. There's this huge host that developed. And when Daemon rides out, well, he's been abandoned by everybody. He's riding out alone.
But he still thinks somehow that...
He'll manage.
Yeah, he's so convinced.
So he challenges Bloodraven to single combat, and of course Bloodraven says, arrest him. He's seized and dragged off. So the fact is, Egg was wrong about who was leading the army, but the army was actually coming. And here's the thing. Crown Lands to where this army's been on the march for, some of these people have been on the march for a couple of weeks, at least.
Somebody knew.
They knew. This was known. We know Plum was a spy of Bloodraven, apparently. He said he was spying for him. He was one of his eyes. And it's
clear that the lack of caution that we see from the conspirators is probably indicative of how they've been carrying this out all along. And
Bloodbraven has lots of spies.
Yeah.
And the other thing, then clearly it seems that he deliberately let it get to this point. He could have probably stopped it earlier, but he wanted to see who would actually show up, who would. So at the end, when Dunk goes to meet Bloodraven, there's Gorman Peak's head on a spike, and there's Black Tom's head on a spike, and Bloodraven's going through a list and checking off names, and Dunk said, these are more men who are going to die for this. He's talking to Lord Butterwell at the time, and I think
he does manage to survive this time as well.
Yeah, Butterwell manages to kind of cast it out doubt about how he was involved to just lose his castle. White Walls is torn down.
Yeah.
I don't
the
know.
ground raised.
It'll be raised, salted, as a symbol of what happens when you try to.
Yeah, because Bloodraven is concerned that this could otherwise become, another red grass field. I think he says a meeting point where people would kind of flock to who are Black Dragon supporters, and he doesn't want any chance of it becoming a monument.
There's a little detail I mentioned earlier: the White Walls being raised. I mean, White Walls named for the fact that it had obviously costly, I think, for an Vale, white marble and things. A detail about the Crossroad Inn, and it's way back in the books, is the fact that its chimneys and turrets are all of a white stone, and there's a wall around it of white stone, and I think it's very likely that what happened with his raised people wouldn't just leave the stones lying around. It's a quarry of prepared stones. People were carting them off and using them elsewhere. So I suspect, even if it's not really, I'm not absolutely certain about the whole Crossroad Inn being associated with this inn at the lake or whatever. It's clear that George did intend the Crossroad Inn to have an association with White Walls, because its ferry did go to there, and Lord Haraway's town as well. And it's just a little connection that George, is a subtle little connection George has made between the books and the story. And Lord Frey gets away kind of entirely scot-free, more or less, other than Bloodraven will be keeping an eye on him. But
so
and Daemon's fate.
Note about that.
He asks what happens to Daemon. Well, Bloodraven is very clever here.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should also note that Daemon did dream true. Bloodraven points that out.
Well, at the end, let's get through. First, what happens to Daemon is he says, if we kill him, he becomes a martyr.
Yeah.
And he has brothers.
Yes, and it's very awkward for his next in line brother to proclaim himself king when his older brother is still alive and claiming to be Daemon the Second. You can't have Daemon the Third before you have Daemon the Second out of the way.
So basically, he'll be a hostage, a ornament. I think he uses an ornament at the court. A guest.
Yes, long-term guest.
Long-term guest. Obviously, we know from there were more Blackfire rebellions. He will die in some fashion.
Probably arranged by one of his brothers.
Maybe arranged. Could be natural causes. We don't really know. I mean,
but Bloodraven has his ideas of how to handle these future upcoming Blackfire rebellions, current Blackfire rebellions. He's obviously involved in the handling of quite a few of them, and seems to have certainly taken that as a personal mission to keep an eye on those Blackfires.
So coming back to what you said, yes, and at the end, maybe he dreamt true about an egg hatching into a dragon, but maybe it's Egg himself coming into his own, kind of, if it was bold lie, kind of inadvertently paralyzing, kind of starting the downfall of this whole conspiracy.
Yeah. Because, I mean, that's the one thing that Daemon seemed to have failed to learn, that nobody told him, who, he probably didn't have anyone around him who knew anything about prophecy. You can't, it's a double-edged sword, and it's or a sword without a hilt, I think, is that.
Sorcery in general, but it's also Morrowind has a much more sort of lurid one, but prophecy is very sweet until, like a prostitute with remembrance mouth until she decides to bite. But it's
easy to misread things.
Yes.
Because there's always, it will come through in some fashion, but how.
Yeah, that's an important thing. I mean, I think the evidence is, in George's view, everyone who has genuine visions is actually seeing things that will happen, but they may misunderstand what will happen.
Obviously, Danis the Dreamer was spot on about Valyria going kaboom, and
there's been other things where, Melisandre saw Renly. She believed it was a possible future where if you didn't do this, Renly would be at the gates of King's Landing leading an army.
Yeah,
and
that's interesting. She talks about possible futures, whereas the dragon dreams.
The thing with her is, I think, as we've discussed her previously, is she has dealt with her occasional misunderstanding of things by saying these are possible, by the concluding that these must be possible, but they're not always right. Yeah. And whereas the reality is they are all correct, but you don't know what they mean.
No, because obviously Renly is at the gates of King's Landing.
Renly's ghost. Yes. So she sees it, but she doesn't understand it. Then the last thing is egg ass. Well, the last thing he wants to know is the egg. How did it get stolen? And blah blah blah. There's maybe someone climbed up the privy shaft. But an egg, it's too small for a man. And Dunk really, well, not a dwarf. And in fact, I think there's a whole thing where the dwarves were at one point spotted kind of moving equipment of theirs away in a chest or something, and they're going. They were leaving after the feast and so on, so they were clearly agents of.
Yeah, Bloodraven has an assortment of.
And so ends the Second Blackfire Rebellion, and before it even started, really.
Yes, an aborted attempt at the Blackfire Rebellion.
But there's one last piece to discuss. Before we get to that last mystery or last detail, the coda that I mentioned that we were referring to earlier.
Yes, when Dunk steps out and sees Peake's head on a spike, he goes up and closes his eyes, sort of a bit of a gesture of thanks and sort of respect in a sense, because if it wasn't for Peake, he wouldn't be there. Peake killed Saruman's squire, or his prior squire, and made it possible for Dunk to become his squire.
It was a nice touch.
It was a nice touch, sort of reflecting on the odd things that people's decisions can lead to, and people's actions can lead to, and how it all sort of fits together.
So the last mystery is this whole Maynard Plum ends up kind of disappearing. He ends up trying to get Dunk to get Egg and get out of there, and then he's gone at the morning of the joust between Glendon and so on, and we have all this stuff about he's related to Sirius Plum, and he's a bit Serpic, and he clearly knows a lot, and then there's a whole thing where he shows up and Dunk for a second is like, yeah, it's one-eyed guy coming at me, and then it's Maynard, and
it kind of all fits
together. It all fits together because many people have caught this, but I know there are some who may have read it who still haven't caught it. So Maynard Plum is Bloodraven. That's very obvious. Look, one of the first things that we're told early on, after in this whole thing discussing this Septon who is preaching as the king and preaching as Bloodraven and for the Blackfires, is all the reasons people dislike Bloodraven. Some claim that the King's Hand was a student of the dark arts who could change his face, put on the likeness of a one-eyed dog, even turn into a mist. Packs of gaunt grey wolves hunted down his foes, men said, and carrying crows spied for him and whispered. Well, some of that
makes it sound like Dracula.
Some of that is not true, but we know Bloodraven is the last Greenseer. We know that he ends up having magical abilities, and I think what Dunk saw, the one-eyed man approaching him, was actually him for a moment seeing through a glamour. Melisandre mentions glamours are, actually it's not her, it's in fact it's the kindly man speaking to Arya about how some users of magic are able to use glamours, and these are to make someone seem like who they aren't. And I think Melisandre's one says, Mance Rayder, when she makes him look like Rattleshirt, he has this collar, this bracelet, this thick sort of heavy iron bracelet like a ruby or something on his head. That is a
power source for it.
It's an object that allows you attach. You need an object to attach a glamour to. It has to be touching the person, has to be close to them. Well, I think that Moonstone brooch is his. He has a glamour attached to it to make himself look like who he isn't. In fact, and by the way, if thinking about it a bit, I mean, Melisandre has an item that she always carries on her person. Her collar, her ruby collar, like glows and such. And that has led some to wonder. Which she never takes off. Which she never takes off.
Even when she bathes.
Even when she bathes. Yep.
I have a very few thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, there's some thoughts about what that could mean, but one of the things is also because she's looking. I mean, there's reasons to think that she herself she may not look like what we think she looks like.
On the thing that I don't know how much of a glamour she could be wearing, because I suspect it takes a lot of power.
She has a lot of power.
She has, but she does note that, I mean, being on the wall, certain things are easy, so she doesn't have unlimited resources. She mentions that some things are strenuous.
Yeah.
I don't know that for example, I don't think she looks ancient. I don't think her youth is a glamour. I think that may have to do with...
the fire.
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it might be the red eyes, the hair color, things like that. Just, she probably has maybe, regular red hair, and then makes it...
Yeah. Silver goldy kind of hair. Purple eyes. There's all sorts of theories about who Melisandre is.
But I think smaller things like that, for example, not changing her whole face, but changing...
details.
Details like that.
Making yourself look a little better than she actually does, perhaps. Who knows? But in any case, so he made her plumb as Bloodraven. And all these little remarks like no, who's to say we aren't? Oh, ho, ho.
Yeah.
Or, Viserys Plum maybe not wanting to acknowledge a relationship. Well, yeah, because you're actually half brothers, not. And you're Bloodraven, and people don't like Bloodraven in general, and maybe you don't care to. I mean, the distant thing. He might have meant this as distant, and they're not friendly on good terms.
Yeah. Sure. No, he's. I mean, what it does, I like the look that you get at Bloodraven in this one. Before, with the first two Duncan Egg stories, you get a sense of a rather more sinister figure.
Yes.
With this, and then even more so with The World of Ice and Fire, you're starting to get the sense of somebody who...
extremely pragmatic.
Very pragmatic, quite ruthless, not needlessly cruel or anything like that, I wouldn't say. He's going to do...
what it takes.
What it takes to preserve the kingdom.
No.
Maybe he's seen something.
Maybe he's seen something, yes, it's entirely possible.
I mean, he's the person who probably maybe gets himself sent to the wall to fulfill... May have seen something that needed him to be there.
It's all very speculative.
It's all very speculative, but he's clearly somebody who will go to great lengths to make sure certain things happen.
To the point where some have started theorizing that maybe Bloodraven, that the events of the novels have to some degree, and some awful events, but he is an ends justify the means, and that he has perhaps seen ways to get, for example, Bran to where he needs him to be, which requires things like Winterfell getting burned and people massacred, and that maybe somehow he has had a negative influence leading to this moment because he sees a bigger fight. And we've seen this before. We've seen with Corran Halfhand telling Jon about your vows, that the whole purpose of these vows are to defend the wall on the realms of men. Like nothing else matters. You do what you have to. Yeah. Right? And they're literally...
Bloodraven is defending the realm with everything he's got, basically.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about him, and I think this next novel is going to be really fascinating. I am not convinced that he's the sinister side of it.
No, I'm not behind that he necessarily has been engineering everything. But
well, I know where people get on to Urine Crow's Eye, who insists that he dreamt that he's dreamt that he could fly, and that some wondered if he, like Bran, had the three-eyed crow coming to visit him and telling him things, and that this has led him onto his path to. So yes, I can see how things are turning in your head about dragon horns and dragons and all this stuff.
There's possibilities.
We'll see, but I'm not convinced. But it's really interesting because it shows a lot of depth. But yeah, Bloodraven is a fascinating figure, and I've seen people argue all sorts of things. I've seen people argue that while everything. He was thinking too short term, and he was solving short term problems, but he wasn't looking at the long term and this was leading to all this dissatisfaction. But he was basically dealing with a fire as it showed up, and didn't kind of think of how do we present things, how do we make a bigger narrative so that people stop being opposed to us. Like, he wasn't interested. He didn't care if people liked him or not, and that this was a problem.
It's true. He does seem to have, from early on, I guess, realized that. I'm not going to be a likable person, so I might as well embrace that.
He's an albino. He looks weird. He's smart. He is clearly not your typical. I mean, he's apparently a very capable fighter. He lost his eye fighting Bittersteel, but he survived. And originally, I mean, I guess I would reveal this. And George's original notes about the Blackfire Rebellion, the Redgrass Field, that he sent us, and he obviously changed this in the end, which he mentioned to us when he was when the graphic adaptation of The Sworn Sword was happening. Because in the adaptation, they show a little montage of various things, and one of the things is Bittersteel and Blackfield, and Bloodraven fighting one another, and George said, Bloodraven loses his eye, and he said in his note, and we had pointed it out to the artist, that Bittersteel loses a hand. But George then said, that I was thinking of it, I decided it's too much like Jaime, so he actually dropped that bit.
But it was supposed to be sort of an eye for a hand kind of. I mean, they, kind of building up this famous rivalry between the two of them, and I mean, it's interesting because you never really get a sense of. It's personal with Bittersteel, quite clearly for Bloodraven, or at least it starts out that way.
Bloodraven talks in literally, the brother he loved, the brother he despised, and and there's a question like, which is which? I mean, it's clear, I think, that he didn't like Bittersteel.
No,
Bracken,
but it suggests that with Daemon, he might have been quite close to, but he doesn't really have a personal thing against the Blackfires, but he is sworn to the king, and he is defending the realm. Whereas
the other brother he could love is actually Daemon. Very good.
True, but
in fact,
it would be interesting
that's another reason. That's
Daemon.
the question, because he only talks about two brothers, but he's got Daemon as well. So he may be actually saying, for example, that he despised Daemon for his grasping ways, and
it's true. George could
be playing with that.
Be playing with that. It's absolutely true. But
alternatively, this is his revealing of how Daemon was not his brother, but he actually was the Dragon Knight's son, and that he doesn't bother thinking about it. But anyways,
the most simplistic explanation is that he hated Bittersteel, and I think like Daemon, that sort of gives that conflict about which side
he would blame Bittersteel in part for kind of leading Daemon, because I mean, the Wars of Fire, which we wrote with George, discusses the fact that Bittersteel in particular, his anger at feeling that he never got what he deserved, and that he was a leading with Fireball. Like they were the two main architects of Daemon deciding to go into a rebellion.
It seems just that all those Bracken and Bracken descendants are generally going to be
troublesome people. It's
like Peaks and Bracken.
So let's wrap this up. It ends on that note, and we've had Dunk and Egg talking about going to the wall. Kyle the cat was talking about how at least Lord Stark was fighting the Ironborn and so on, and I think they suggested Glendon that he might come with them.
Yeah, I think Glendon is probably somebody we're going to see more of in future Dunk
but
and Egg stories.
That will be for our fourth.
Yes.
If we ended up splitting this into two parts, then our fifth and find out where
well,
we
it'll
look
be
at
4A and 4B, 3A and 3B anyway.
Yeah, so our
It's a
fourth
mystery.
part, discussing the future of what we know for Dunk and Egg.